Now, as a teacher, has this ever happened to you? You teach something on a Monday, you decide to test on a Friday, you grade the results, and it's as if the students were never there, that the learning was really low. And it annoys you because you spent a lot of time preparing lessons and preparing activities, but they still didn't learn it the way you had hoped. What happened? Hey everyone, welcome back to Activate Your Classroom. I'm your host, Glenn Wagner. We're all frustrated on occasion when students forget what we teach them, and we can't take it personally. Because in this video, I'm going to share with you why students forget what we teach them, and they come by it very honestly. But most importantly, I want to share with you some strategies that you can use on a day-to-day basis, very small ones, that help make that learning stick. Now, let's talk briefly about what it means to learn, because that's a term that teachers use all the time. They want their students to learn. What does that mean? Well, the experts say this, that learning is any relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of practice and experience. And I want to underscore this part, the relatively permanent change, because that is what we're going to refer to as learning being sticky. So how do we make that relative permanent change happen? Now, in order to understand that, we better understand the enemy of learning, something that we all possess, something that is a feature of our minds and not a bug. And it is this, the forgetting curve. Look, we all naturally forget. It is just something that happens to every single one of us. The question is not so much forgetting, but how to overcome that forgetting. So you can learn something on a particular day, and a couple of days later, if you don't do something with that knowledge, you're going to forget it. And you're just going to have little fleeting memories of what that was. So what we want to do here is to see if we can combat that forgetting curve. In other words, we want to see if we can flatten it out in such a way that we have a long-term memory of those key ideas that we teach our students. Now, we're going to go a little deeper here because if we want to understand how to make learning stick, then it's a good idea to understand what goes on in the brain when we're trying to learn something. So let's have a quick peek about what that looks like. And we start here. We start with these little guys between our ears, the neuron. Turns out that we have about 85 billion of these things packed between our ears that help us learn. But learning only happens when we get those neurons to connect, when they start making these little tiny chemical connections between them. And when we do that, we start linking those neurons, and that is when the beginning of learning happens. So consider a practice that we're all familiar with, say riding a bike. When you first learn to ride a bike, it's a bit of a struggle, but your brain is working really hard to link those neurons together, to get them to touch one after the other in such a way that you're creating these learning pathways in the brain so that we can remember how to go about riding a bike. And after a fair amount of practice, it becomes easy. It becomes really smooth. And that is when the learning has happened. That is when the neurons have now linked together and they're solid. And it's going to be really difficult not to remember how to ride a bike or, say, tie a shoelace. You can think a little bit of the neurons connecting in our brains, creating those pathways, the way you see a pathway in a field. Once you've marked that pathway over and over again, it's really hard to rub it out, just like it's really hard to rub out a practice or experience once it's been practiced over and over again. So how do you make learning sticky? How do you make it connect in such a way that you have a memory in place, not only for yourself, but also for your students? Well, the key here is retrieval. You need to constantly have opportunities to bring that knowledge out into the brain and play with it in order to make those neurons link ever more strongly. And in this way, we combat the forgetting curve. So imagine you learn something on day one. Doesn't matter what it is, but the point is that at some point you say, you know what, I'm going to think about it again, so much so that I'm going to send an email. And then maybe a day or two later, you decide, that was so interesting that you decide to go on Insta Talkbook and you fired off another idea of what it is that you learned. So you've retrieved once, now you've retrieved twice. And you might wait a little longer and then go off and tell a colleague. And now you're recalling that knowledge again. That's a third retrieval. So now look what happens. You start flattening out that curve so that it becomes incredibly difficult not to remember those ideas once you've actually recalled them. Now, the research is really clear on this idea of retrieval. It's been around for several decades now. And it basically shows that retrieval really works in order to improve student learning. And the more often students have an opportunity to retrieve, the more likely they're going to remember those key ideas and those key concepts you want them to know. Now, it turns out that there's a wonderful added benefit to retrieval. And they looked at student test anxiety and found that students who had more opportunities to retrieve felt less anxious when they were going into a test, which makes sense if you think about it, because the more familiar you become with an idea, the more likely you're going to remember it and be able to apply it. So let's talk a little bit about how to make that learning stick, some strategies that you can use day in and day out, small ones that take only a small amount of time out of your lesson in order to make that learning stick, in order to make those neurons connect with each other. Now, the brain dump is one of the easiest strategies, and you can use it during a lesson, after the lesson, or the next day or the next week for that matter. And it's simple. Have students pair up and then say you're trying to get them to recall about photosynthesis. Have them turn to a partner and get them to explain everything that they remember about photosynthesis, each student taking a turn, and encourage them that you don't have to be absolutely perfect, but it's the act of retrieving that's going to make those neurons really start connecting again and again, so the students will have a better chance of remembering. And you can go up and down the rows and listen in on their conversations and really see if they're getting the concept. Now, the next strategy is called the minute paper, and it's related to the brain dump. Because what you're going to do here is take an idea that you want students to work with, and the students are going to write out what it is that they know about it. And you give them a certain amount of time for that. So maybe perhaps you had a lesson yesterday on the events leading to World War II. Have them pull out a whiteboard or marker or a piece of paper and a pencil and say, hey, write down everything that you remember about the events leading up to World War II. Don't worry about if it's going to be perfect. That's not what we're looking for, but we want to retrieve that knowledge and find out how much you remember. Ready? Go. Then you can go up and down the aisles and you can get some feedback on how the students are remembering your lessons from the other day. The next strategy is to think, pair, share. And it's a common one. It should be one that every teacher has in their toolbox. Now, with Think, Pair, Share, you usually give students a question or some idea to play with, and they think individually about what that answer might be or those ideas might look like. Then you pair them up and they share with a partner. And basically, they can test their thinking or share different ideas, which is exactly what you want. Again, you can go up and down the rows and listen in on their conversation. And then get the conversation going and have maybe a couple of students share publicly what it is that they were talking about or learning about. So here's a simple example, one I pulled out on ecology, and say students are learning about food webs. You can pause the video and have a read here. But the point is that students are going to get a chance to apply that knowledge in a way that gets them thinking about what food webs actually are. So in the Think, Pair, Share, try to avoid questions that rely only on definitions and facts. They may be important, but they're not going to get students thinking at a high level. And what you really want to do is to go up the level. So are they applying their knowledge? Are they analyzing something with it? Are they evaluating or creating? Because that is where the fun in learning actually is. And as the students recall that knowledge as they're applying it, that is a retrieval. And that is making those neurons again ever more sticky with each other. Now, the final strategy is called time for two. And this is one where if you're a teacher who is teaching a skill or a process, you might find very, very useful. So you set up time for two this way. Ultimately, you want to find two different questions exploring the same concept. And this is going to ensure individual accountability, as you'll see in a moment. So you're going to pair up students, student A and student B, and the two questions are not going to be too difficult. They're not going to be too easy either. They're just going to be just right in such a way that every student will have a measure of success as they solve the problem individually. Now, here's an example in physics. You have two problems here. You don't need to read them, but each student is working on a problem surrounding the same concept. So student A solves problem A and student B solves problem B. And then after a certain amount of time that you suggest, then you have A explain their reasoning and understanding to B, and B explains theirs to A. In this case, there's two retrievals here. One in solving the problem, and the second explaining the problem and what it is that they did in order to get their solution. Now, here's an example in English where you have two paragraphs that might be exploring imagery to create mood. And perhaps in a history class, you might throw up some images where you get students to think about war propaganda, say, on what is being expressed in these images. So let's sum up. Idea number one. First of all, there is no learning without retrieval. Doesn't matter how clear your lesson is, doesn't matter how well you delivered it. If the students are not retrieving that knowledge and making it work in their minds, they're not making the neural connections and they're not going to create memories of that knowledge that you had explained to them. And idea number two, well, make learning stick by providing multiple opportunities in order to practice and experience what it is that you've taught them. Thank you for listening, everyone. I hope that this was useful to you, and I hope I've given you some ideas to try in your classroom. Please hit the subscribe button below to encourage me for further videos, which more are soon to come. And if you have a moment, hop on over to my website at nextlevelclassroom.com. And there you'll often find a free workshop to help you engage students and also to help make that learning stick. I think you'll enjoy it. I think that we can come together and create a beautiful learning community in order to make learning great, not only for our students, but also for our professional lives as well. Hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone.